All right, so now we're on to everyone's favorite part of any woodworking project, dealing with the plywood. So we're going to be using plywood in a few different places here, obviously for the drawer bottoms, because that's just going to be a little bit easier, as well as the back panels of all 4 pieces of furniture here. Now, you might be wondering why I'm using plywood. If you guys have followed my channel for any amount of time, you know that I despise plywood just in general. In any of the pieces I make for myself, I do not use plywood, purely because I think it takes away from the overall quality of the piece of furniture. Now, again, to each his own. You can use plywood if you want. I'm not trying to insult you in any way if you do, but I just personally don't like using it. So the reason that I'm using plywood in this project is just purely because of money. And so the plywood is just going to be fairly simple, even though plywood is somewhat expensive right now, as I'm sure you all can understand. Basically, all I have to do is make 2 cuts, slap the back panel onto each piece of furniture here, and it's done. There's nothing super complex about it. So this is 1/4-inch sanded pine plywood. So a decently nice stuff. It's just from Home Depot, so it's not like a nice quality hardwood, but it is a 3-ply hardwood, which means that if I need to thin it down or I need to do any working to it, there is some room to do that. Now, the reason that I went with sanded pine and not something like maple is because maple is more expensive, for one, and was just not available. Alright, so before we install the back panel on the wide dresser here, I just wanted to stop and take a look at some of our divider joinery here. So when we did the joinery for this, I mentioned that there's a very specific way that you have to install these in order to allow for wood movement. So when we installed these, I put a little bit of glue right at the front of the tails just to hold everything together. Then there's a screw about 1 inch in from the front that's just in a normal drilled hole. We pre-drilled a straight hole, countersunk it, put the screw in. But then on the back, we have a screw that's also holding the panel in, but it's got a slot to it so it can move back and forth. And so if we look at the back, we can see that these dividers are now inset by just a little bit. Some of them are, maybe a 64th of an inch at most. Most of them are just kind of a hairline, just barely under that level. Now, when I put all this together, I made sure that these were all flushed up. I used the hand plane and flushed all these up perfectly with the back so that I knew that they would be perfectly in line. Now, the nice thing is that looking at the back, we obviously have had some expansion and contraction, whereas when you look at the front, everything is still perfectly in line and holding together properly. So that means that the joinery that I used to install these panels is allowing these panels to pull in from the back and push out through the back. And there'll always be that little bit of movement in there, but it's all happening in kind of the invisible area of this dresser. Door here. Alright, and so for the drawer bottoms, I just skipped over. I didn't show any footage of it because it's just cutting plywood and sliding it into a groove. It's not an exciting thing. But what is important to talk about here is the philosophy of how you properly make a drawer. And so what I did here is I fit a 1/4-inch piece of plywood into this groove on the bottom section of the drawer here. And as you guys saw when we were making the drawers, we left this back end open so that this bottom panel is replaceable. Now, there's a very important theory that goes into why you should build drawers this way and not permanently affix your drawer bottom into the bottom of your drawer. So if you have an item that is very likely to get damaged or have wear and tear to it, what you want to make sure of is that the part that is easiest to replace is the part that is more likely to get broken. So a perfect example of this from my own life experience is the bolt on an oil pan of a vehicle. When I was learning to change oil, I had made the mistake of not understanding my lefts and my rights and having my dad telling me, oh, just give it your all and that bolt should come loose. And so what happened is I stripped the bolt that was in the oil pan. But this is exactly how that should work. Because when I finally got that bolt out, we realized that it was only the threads on this bolt that were stripped. The threads on the oil pan were just fine, and this is exactly what you want to have happen. And so it's a lot easier to replace a $5 or $10 bolt, but it's a lot more expensive to either rethread or just completely reinstall a new oil pan. And so with the drawers here, one of the things that I've seen some people do is they'll take a piece of 3/4-inch plywood and mount it into the bottom of the drawers permanently. And they think that they've got this solid drawer bottom that can never be broken out, so it's going to be just fine. The problem with that is, though, is if you were to hit that 3/4-inch thick piece of plywood, what's more likely to break is this support groove right near the bottom of your drawer. Because unless you put the support groove a full inch up, it's going to be a lot weaker than that 3/4 inch piece of plywood. By not only making this bottom replaceable, but by only using a 1/4 inch thick piece, if you decide to punch through this drawer bottom, or just over time it wears out and it starts to crack and break, this drawer bottom is going to break first before this drawer box ever starts to crack or have any damage to it. Because this is a much stronger section of wood here than anything on this 1/4 inch thick piece of plywood. If something in this construction of this drawer needs to break for some kind of situation, you want it to be that drawer bottom, because all I have to do to replace this drawer bottom, pull out the broken bits, grab a new piece of 1/4 inch plywood, cut it to size, drop it in, put one screw in, and it's back in place. And so that ends basically the most miserable part of making a bedroom set, which I'm really glad that this part's over, because now all of our drawers are done, all of the bottom panels are in those drawers, we have the back panels on each of those pieces of furniture, and we can now move on to the tops and the fronts. So this is where stuff starts to get fun, because now this is a lot like the side panels where we get to have some of that fun creative freedom and work with some really nice wood. So not that maple isn't nice, but it's just, building drawers is very much so a chore when it comes to woodworking, because there's a lot of effort that goes into them, but no one ever really appreciates or sees them very much. So what we're going to be doing now is we're going to start working on the drawer fronts. And so I started by doing the top 4 on the tall dresser here. Now these are the most complex ones to do on this whole set here, because for the most part they're just kind of floating in space. And so trying to get them all aligned in that was a very complex thing and took a lot of time, and I didn't want to show that on camera because I didn't really have an idea what I was doing. I've never done, these inset floating drawer fronts on a drawer box before. All the drawers that I built in the past have just been solid half-blind construction. So they're a little bit easier to fit up in my opinion. And so now we're gonna move on to these bottom 3 here, and I'll actually do these on camera so that you guys can see what I'm doing. And well, it's gonna be easiest if I just explain this first so that it makes a little more sense when I start rolling with it. And so what I'm gonna start by doing is just milling a piece of lumber to fit oversized in this space here. So the one dimension that I know is precise is I know that between this post and this post, I want to take whatever this measurement is and minus 1/8 of an inch. Because what that'll do is that'll leave me with a 1/16 of an inch on either side, because that's what I've chosen as my side distance. On the top here, what I have is on the sides, I have a 1/16 of an inch difference. On the bottom here, I have a 1/16, and then between each of the drawer fronts, I have an 1/8 of an inch. Now I'm leaving an 1/8 of an inch in there just so that there is a little bit more definition between those drawers, and so that if there is any seasonal wood movement, they don't ever get pinched against each other. And so the goal here is to start with my oversized piece, and I know that from that oversized piece that my 2 ends that are going to be perfectly square off of that piece need to be perfectly parallel with these outside edges here. Because then what I can go through and do is if there's any shape change in this area here, so there might be a small dip in the middle here, or if this area too is slightly skewed, I can take some material off a certain corner until I get the bottom edge lined up. Then I can go through and remove material from the top edge until it too lines up with this top area with about a 1/16 of an inch gap. So it's really going to be all about just having some patience here, which is very hard to do, but it's going to be very important. Okay, so that was way easier than I was expecting. The bottom 2 drawers here, I was able to fit them just using the table saw because these areas down here, perfectly square. So that saved me a lot of time. Both reference surfaces for each of these drawer fronts down here is square, as well as this bottom reference surface for this top one here is perfectly square too. So this makes life super easy. So on both corners, I've got a perfect 1/8 of an inch gap there. Now all I need to do is go through and remove the middle section of this board and just cup it a little bit. So right now we have, maybe about a 1/16 of an inch gap there. So that means that in this middle section here, we only have about a 1/16 of an inch of deflection in this bottom frame here. So that's not really a big deal in my opinion. And so all I'm gonna do here is just use my spoke shave to just slowly cup out the middle section here. So I'm just gonna put some marks on the front here, marking my middle section so I know basically where I'm working out of. And I'm just gonna work this whole edge down to a slight cup until we can fit in here and we can fit this 1/8 inch spacer all the way along this top edge here. Alright guys, so I had to take a break from this. Last night I screwed up royally on the front of the dresser here, and I basically just had to walk away and just do nothing for last night, where normally I would be out here working on the furniture. And so pretty clearly looking at the front here, you can see what the issue is, and that is this handle right here, and then coincidentally the handle on the back side of this bottom drawer here. And so it's fairly evident that I mismeasured when I was putting in these holes, and we've got a serious problem here because all the way down here, they line up. Then we have this one staggered out, then they line up again down at the bottom here. So the fact that I was able to get all these to line up nicely is fairly impressive. So in my head, I'm fully planning to just remake these two drawer fronts. I've got a little bit of material left over. I think that it should be enough to cover these two drawer fronts, and then I should still have enough material laying around to do what I need to do. But what I'm gonna try to do before I just go ahead and remake some drawer fronts is I'm gonna try something. And that is I'm going to plug these two holes that I have in here that are in the wrong position, and then I'm going to re-drill new holes. And so one of the big issues when you're using plugs is that they don't always line up or match nicely, because generally you're never gonna find a perfect match to the piece of wood that you're trying to plug. Now the trick here is that because these are drawer fronts and you're never gonna see this inside face, what I'm thinking is if I can take my plug from the inside face of this drawer front here, the area you're never gonna see again, I can take my plug from there, move it to the outside here, and we should have a near perfect grain and color match there. Alright guys, so that is the repair done, and I have to say I'm absolutely amazed how well that actually worked out. So much so to the point with when I was passing this to the drum sander, when I would take my eyes off the board for a few seconds, I would end up losing where these little patches are. So it's one of those things where if you don't know about it, you will never ever be able to tell. Because what you're looking for here to really detect them is that this one is kind of has a dead giveaway because there's a dark streak in the oak that kind of gets broken by it, and then that leads your eye to the perfectly circular figure in there. But other than that, if you don't notice, if you're just looking at the drawer front the way it is, you're never going to notice these. So I'm really amazed. And some of them even came out better than that. This top one up here, pretty much invisible because some of the dark streaks that were in the plug lined up perfectly with the dark streaks in the oak. So this one worked out awesome. All right, and so with the tall dresser done now, we can move on to doing the wide dresser. Now this is the one that I'm really looking forward to working on. And the reason that I started with the tall dresser is just purely because because there's much more room to make mistakes there. If I needed to replace one of the drawer fronts because it didn't work out, I could do that. If I end up screwing up one of these drawer fronts, I'm gonna have to go and get a whole new board in order to create the look that I want. Because what I'm aiming for here is to do a full grain run across the front of the dresser here. Now this is one of the coolest things you can do with dressers like this, is because all these drawers are in line with each other, by taking one piece of wood and running it all the way across the length here, cutting it up into your different drawer fronts, the look of this is just amazing. Because you get this continuity of grain running all through all your drawers, and it's something that I really want to do for these pieces of furniture here. Okay, so you guys were probably expecting a shot of the dressers all done with all the drawers in them and everything ready to go, and I stole that from you. And so you can see I've got a bunch of the drawers stacked on the table saw behind me there, and I'm getting them ready for finish. So I didn't show that final clip because I kind of want to save that till the very end of the series so you guys can kind of see this stuff as it all comes together. Because it's looking really good. I can say that very honestly. I love the way this is coming out. Definitely doing the drawer fronts with just a solid piece of wood like this looks spectacular. Especially in the wide dresser where we've got that full board running across the whole length of the drawer fronts. That looks really cool.